Today on a special edition of SUTV News, we'll learn the history of the Cumberland Valley Rail Trail. More specifically, the enduring presence of Railroad Street and the hard workers who made it possible. All that and more right now. Thanks for joining us on SUTV News. I'm Sam Fritz. The wonderful town of Shippensburg may never have been what it is today without the presence of Railroad Street, or otherwise known more famously today as Earl Street. Chase Deemer has the story.
Railroad Street went through town, showcasing many buildings, more notably the popular locations on Earl Street.
So Railroad Street is what we know of as Earl Street today, kind of is the I guess you could say the prime meridian of Shippensburg. It runs north and south, and it's also runs through the square, so it kind of separates north and south, east and west. Popular shops and businesses were right there surrounding the square, so people getting off the train didn't have to go very far for a good, nice place to stay, a nice place to eat.
The Select Diner in Earl Street today was a more popular place to stay and eat in the 1800s.
So the railroad really helped build up Shippensburg as we see it today. I mean, it is a small town. The borough itself, and the borough limits, there's 1,000 permanent residents. But the community itself is much larger.
The areas were once heavily populated by tourists coming from the northeastern states.
The railroad, because of the railroad, you're going to have a lot more industry to move things in and out. That's why you had 3 railroads coming through Shippensburg. You needed ways to move goods from these production facilities.
For SUTV News, I'm Chase Deemer.
This railroad was not an easy task to make. There was a lot of labor going into creating the Cumberland Valley Railroad. Logan Funk has the story.
To build a railroad like this, a lot of workers were needed, and the Irish immigrants flooding off the ships in the late 1800s was the answer.
So overwhelmingly, the folks who built the Cumberland Valley Railroad in the 19th century were primarily Irish immigrants to the United States, young men, fairly new to the country, and the railroad was entirely built by hand.
They labored all day, muscling through limestone and dirt. The Irish were limited on supplies too, so the same clothes worn the day before were the same clothes worn the next day working on the railroad.
Back-breaking labor with shovels and picks, some mules and horses to move things, but otherwise, even up until the early 20th century, if you look at pictures of construction on the railroad, it's all being done with very sort of primitive levers and pulleys and cranes, nothing mechanized, entirely muscle labor building the tracks.
This job was the definition of nitty-gritty work, when factoring in heat from the sun, heavy cotton clothes, limited water, and breathing in limestone dust with every swing of the pickaxe.
The first railroad ran in 1838, 1839, and then it just got bigger and bigger, used during the Civil War to move goods down in through the Shenandoah, or the Cumberland Valley into the Shenandoah Valley, supplying Union troops in Virginia. And then after the Civil War, you get this industrial revolution, and you start to get an abundance of railroads in this area. For basically in the end of the 19th century, for a 10-hour day, they were getting paid a little bit more than $1 a day to work on the railroad. We definitely have pictures of some of the railroad workers, and it looks like, you would imagine really grim, hard work. And, but there are men and women working on the railroad right until the tracks finally come up in the 1980s. So it's an important industry, an important craft for people in this area, for over 150 years.
For SUTV, I'm Logan Funk.
Since the start of production on the railroad, many last names of the workers are still around today. From generation to generation, the current Cumberland Valley residents have family members who helped build the railroad. Chase Deemer has the story.
Not too long ago, there were railroad workers in Shippensburg working on Earl Street.
Come in contact via social media and Facebook and things with people sending me pictures of their father or so working on the railroad, and a lot of these were 1950s to the 1970s that I'm seeing, and a lot of them were local last names, so a lot of these people have been around.
The relatives of the old railway workers are still found in Cumberland Valley today.
Representative of the times of deindustrialization, the rise of other ways of travel, air travel, the interstate highway system, and that you have a less need for the abundance of railroads that we see in the 19th century into the early 20th century. And by that midpoint of the 20th century, you start to really see that kind of dwindle out, and eventually those railroads start to disappear.
Deconstruction of the railroad began in the late 1970s and ended in the early 1980s. The rails were lifted because no one needed to take a train anymore, when they had other ways of faster transportation.
I think there just wasn't a need for that railroad going through where it was going anymore, because it kind of got replaced by the rise of U.S. Route 11 going through Shippensburg up into Carlisle, also Interstate 81. It wasn't as necessary, and was just taking, it was an extra added cost.
By ripping up Railroad Street, this would turn out to be a long project since it went straight through the center of town.
With the downfall of the railroads, a lot of the ones that were, and you deal with these companies that are trying to downsize. CSX, Norfolk Southern, for example, are big railroads even today, and they're doing sufficiently. But one like Conrail, which doesn't even exist anymore, it went defunct in 1999. The rails were lifted and out of the street in 1985. So, not even 20 years later, the company that had run on those rails is no longer there.
For SUTV News, I'm Chase Deemer.
The Cumberland Valley Rail Council needed one ingredient to begin work on the railroad, and their answer was a brilliant young civil engineer named William Roberts. Not only was this type of work hard, but also very dangerous. Since dynamite was not available, the more dangerous alternative was black powder. Logan Funk has the story.
The Cumberland Valley Railroad Council needed a top-notch civil engineer to draft one of East Coast's first railroad systems.
William Milnor Roberts. He's a 25-year-old. He's fresh out of school. He's selected by the Cumberland Valley Railroad Company to be their chief engineer, and as part of that, his first job is to actually walk on foot and select a path from, I guess it would be the west coast of the Susquehanna. He's going to walk the whole way from there to Chambersburg.
Mr. Roberts had a fulfilling career. He went on to be chief engineer for Lancaster and Harrisburg, while in charge of building the two-level lattice truss bridge across the Susquehanna River.
The history behind Mr. Roberts doesn't end here. He's going to go on and design railroads throughout the United States, several more in Pennsylvania, and then be employed by the Emperor of Brazil for a period of time when they're developing their railroad system.
William Roberts may have not did the physical labor, but he led hundreds of workers down the railroad. Brain and brawn came together as one to build the Cumberland Valley Railroad system.
What they really have is their muscles and maybe some pack mules to help with grading, but they don't even have dynamite at this point in time. That's not going to be invented for several years after the railroad is completed. So as far as explosives, you do have black powder.
Black powder may have been extremely dangerous, but without it, we may never have had a railroad in Cumberland Valley.
It would be 10 to 12 hours a day of physical labor, moving soil, and blasting through limestone. And this is a period before, the early construction's a period before dynamite. So this is all done with black powder, which means that they would take hand-used drills, drill holes into the rock, pack it with black powder, stick a fuse in, light it, and blow enormous chunks of rock, which they would then have to load onto carts and haul away.
For SUTV, I'm Logan Funk.
Thanks for tuning in to this special edition of SUTV News. I'm Sam Fritz, and I'll see you down the road.